She arrived quietly, wearing nothing but modest clothes and a calm smile. No entourage, no designer bags, just a woman with grace in her walk and purpose in her silence. But when she tried to check into her first-class seat, the staff looked her up and down and judged. What makes someone look like they belong? Their clothes? Their skin? Their silence? What if the woman they dismissed was actually the most powerful person on that plane? Would they have treated her differently? This story isn't just about a flight. It's about the moment an entire system of assumptions was shattered at 30,000 feet. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about status, power, and respect. Now, let's go back to where it all began. It was just barely dawn at Atlanta International Airport. Streams of people rushed past one another under the cold, golden glow of overhead lights, filling the air with the constant hum of movement. Amid the suits, luxury brand rolling luggage, and high-end Louis Vuitton handbags, a black woman in modest clothing stepped out of an old taxi. Her white blouse was slightly wrinkled, her black pencil skirt plain, and her cream-colored flats worn at the heels. She looked no different from an ordinary passenger, hurriedly heading to yet another business trip. In her hand, she carried an unbranded brown leather handbag and a carefully folded paper boarding pass. Her name was Margaret Ellis, 56 years old. Her face bore the kindness of age and experience, her eyes calm yet profoundly deep. And if one looked closely, they would find in those eyes a quiet intellect and unshakable resilience, etched into her gaze over a lifetime. Margaret was in no rush. Her steps were measured and firm, just slow enough to quietly observe the world around her. She nodded gently to a security guard, smiled at a crying child nestled in their mother's arms near the waiting area. No one noticed her. No one recognized her. And that was exactly how she wanted it. This flight wasn't just another journey. It held weight, not because of the destination, but because of who she was when boarding. Today marked the first time she would fly as the largest shareholder of the very airline operating the flight. A silent yet decisive investment had secured her control of over 41% of the company's shares. But no one knew. Not yet. Today, she wanted to experience the airline's service from a normal perspective. No VIP treatment, no special arrangements. Just a first-class passenger like any other. When Margaret approached the check-in counter, a woman in her early 30s glanced at her. The airline agent's eyes scanned Margaret with a fleeting mix of indifference and subtle judgment. Margaret responded with a courteous smile and offered her e-ticket. "Good morning. I'd like to confirm my first-class seat on Flight 714 to New York." The agent barely glanced at her screen before her eyes returned to Margaret, this time slower, traveling from the worn bag to the scuffed shoes and settling on her composed face. There was an unspoken question in her expression. "You really think you can afford a first-class seat?" "Are you sure, ma'am?" the woman asked, her voice high and frosty. "First class isn't cheap. Perhaps you meant to book economy?" Margaret remained calm. "No, I'm sure. I booked my ticket last week." The agent didn't hide her skepticism. She scanned the ticket with practiced disinterest, eyes flicking briefly to the screen before she pressed a button. "Please wait a moment. I need to verify this with a supervisor." Her voice was loud enough to draw attention. A white man in line behind them raised an eyebrow. A younger woman giggled softly as she looked Margaret up and down. Margaret didn't flinch. She had seen those looks before. Yet she still held on to a quiet hope that perhaps one day she wouldn't be judged for the color of her skin or the simplicity of her appearance. The airport speakers crackled to life, calling for priority passengers to begin boarding. Men in suits began queuing up. The agent, however, made no move to let Margaret through. She didn't say anything further, nor did she need to. Her silence spoke volumes. Margaret exhaled gently. She knew what was coming. She had prepared herself for this, though it was never something she wished for. The flight attendant's name was Lana Whitmore. She had been working for the airline for 8 years and took pride in believing she could identify first-class passengers with a single glance, from the way they dressed and spoke to the subtle fragrance they wore. To Lana, status was something visible, obvious, and the woman standing before her, with a worn leather bag and scuffed flats, clearly didn't fit that image. Lana handed Margaret's phone back with a blank, unbothered expression. I'm sorry, but I still don't see your name on the first-class manifest. You may have selected the wrong cabin when you booked. Without missing a beat, Margaret calmly reached into her bag and offered a printed copy of her booking confirmation. This is my reservation. It's been confirmed. Seat 2A, first class. Lana didn't take the paper. She crossed her arms and let out a deliberate sigh, the kind meant to make someone feel like an inconvenience. Do you know how much seat 2A costs? She asked with pointed skepticism. It's not the kind of ticket just anyone can buy. Margaret's voice remained steady. I'm very well aware. In that case, I'll ask you to wait. We'll finish boarding our priority passengers first and deal with this afterward. Right then, a white couple approached the counter, dressed in designer clothes from head to toe. Lana's demeanor changed instantly. Her face lit up with a warm, familiar smile. Mr. and Mrs. Jacobson, it's been a while. Welcome back. Seats 1B and 1C are ready for you. She bowed slightly, helped them with their luggage, and radiated politeness as if someone had flipped a switch. Margaret watched silently. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a kind of weary understanding at one she had known since she was a little girl growing up in a low-income neighborhood in South Atlanta. A moment later, Lana turned back toward Margaret. Her tone hadn't softened. Please understand, our security procedures are strict. If you can't provide proper elite verification, we'll have to ask you to return to the service counter. Margaret offered more documents, her passport, government ID, and even a platinum loyalty card from the airline. Lana barely glanced at them before dismissing them outright. How did you even get this card? These are issued to regular premium passengers. Not everyone qualifies. People nearby began to notice. A middle-aged man whispered to his wife, Is she profiling her? Judging who gets to fly based on how they look? The woman nodded subtly. It sure seems like it. That flight attendant isn't treating anyone else this way. A young man behind Margaret leaned forward and spoke softly. Would you like me to speak to a supervisor for you? They shouldn't be allowed to treat you like this. Margaret gave him a grateful glance, but gently shook her head. She still wanted to see how far this would go, not out of weakness, but out of a weary familiarity with this kind of unspoken, yet deeply ingrained prejudice. Lana was beginning to show signs of frustration. The way the crowd was watching her now, the way the air thickened around her, made her feel exposed, challenged. She tried to maintain composure, but her tone was growing sharper. You're holding up the line, ma'am. If you're not qualified to fly first class, I suggest you return to the economy waiting area. Margaret slowly lifted her head. Her expression changed, not aggressively, but with a calm power that seemed to shift the entire dynamic in an instant. The quiet strength in her gaze became unmistakable. Are you certain you want to continue down this path? She asked, her voice low but firm enough for others to hear. Absolutely, Lana replied, enunciating each syllable, unaware that she just crossed a line she could never return from. Margaret nodded lightly and folded her documents with care. She said nothing more. She simply stood there, prepared to wait, but no longer just waiting for her seat. She was waiting to witness something else entirely unfold. Margaret remained by the check-in counter, her composure unshaken, but the atmosphere around her was no longer calm. Something in the air had shifted, heavier now, more aware. Whispers began to ripple through the queue. Attention, once fleeting, was now focused and real. A young man in a hoodie and Beats headphones quietly pulled out his phone and began recording. A middle-aged black woman leaned toward another passenger and asked, "What's going on with her?" The response came with a sigh, probably another case of judging people by how they look. Meanwhile, Lana tried to maintain her professional poise, but her face had stiffened into something more rigid. Her confidence was unraveling under the weight of so many eyes watching her every move. But rather than backing down, she leaned further into procedure, clinging to it like a shield. She pressed the button on her walkie-talkie and spoke into it clearly. Dispatch, I need assistance verifying a passenger. Potential disturbance at the priority desk. African-American female, approximately 50 to 60 years old. No confirmed identity. I suspect this may be an invalid boarding attempt. Each word landed like a scalpel, sharp and unmistakable. Margaret heard it all. Her silence now wasn't one of submission. It was deliberate. She was waiting, not for help, but for the moment truth would reveal itself. Soon, another flight attendant arrived, a young Asian man with a calm demeanor and a scanning device in hand. He offered a polite smile and spoke gently. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm the flight coordination assistant. Would you mind showing me your ticket and ID again, please?" Margaret handed over her documents without hesitation. The man scanned the barcode, eyes flicking over the screen. His brow twitched slightly in surprise. "Oh, I apologize. Everything appears to be in order. First-class ticket, seat 2A, fully confirmed and paid." Lana overheard, her voice tight with resistance. "There must be a system error. I didn't see her name earlier." The flight attendant hesitated. "But this is the official confirmation from headquarters. The ticket is valid." Margaret turned to Lana, her expression unchanged but unmistakably firm. "Do you require anything else from me?" Lana paused, clearly unsettled. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of passengers. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Please understand," she said louder. "We're responsible for maintaining the standards of our first-class experience. If a passenger doesn't fit the expected image, we're entitled to further checks." The murmurs behind them grew louder. A young white woman stepped forward, eyebrows raised. "Excuse me, did you just say expected image? What exactly do you mean by that?" A black man nearby spoke more forcefully. "You just openly discriminated. You're saying someone who doesn't look wealthy enough shouldn't be in first class?" The man recording still had his phone up. His live stream viewer count was skyrocketing. Comments scrolled quickly across the screen. "This can't be real. Who is she?" "I hope she's someone powerful. This is exactly why racism still exists." Lana's hands began to tremble. Her voice faltered as she turned to the flight coordination assistant. "Can you double-check her ticket again?" But Margaret had waited long enough. She calmly reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick envelope embossed with the seal of United Sky's executive office. She opened it, retrieved a set of official documents, and held them firmly in hand. No one knew what she was about to do. The young man live streaming whispered in awe, "What's happening? Who is she?" Margaret didn't answer. She turned to Lana, eyes steady. No anger, no emotion wasted, only resolution. "I've stayed silent long enough," she said, "and I think it's time you learned exactly who she really is." The overhead speaker chimed. "Now boarding. First-class passengers on flight US 714 to New York. Gate 18A is open." No one moved. No one stepped forward. The crowd remained frozen, watching, waiting, not to board a plane, but to witness what came next. Margaret folded the envelope, stepped toward the gate, and walked past without asking permission, because none was needed. Lana followed, perhaps instinctively trying to reassert control, but Margaret had already waited long enough. Margaret walked through the boarding gate, leaving behind more than just the stunned faces of the passengers and staff. She was leaving behind a line that had just been crossed, a wall of assumptions that had finally cracked. Each step she took was deliberate, not dramatic, not angry, just certain. In that certainty lay a truth no one had seen coming. She entered the first-class cabin quietly, placing her handbag gently beneath the seat. Her movements were calm, precise, but her silence carried the weight of memory. Memories that, though buried deep, had not faded. They surfaced now with startling clarity, like old photographs suddenly found in perfect condition. She remembered the place she came from, Southside Atlanta, where the night's silence was often broken by distant gunshots. Her father was a construction worker, strong and steady. Her mother worked long hours in a small kitchen, always smiling, always exhausted. Their lives were hard but honest. For a long time, that honesty made Margaret believe the world could be fair, until she turned 13. That day, her mother came home with puffy eyes and trembling hands, still wearing her grease-stained apron. She had been fired, not for making a mistake, but for daring to speak up when a white customer insulted her in front of the entire restaurant. The manager hadn't defended her. He simply said, "If you can't stay quiet, don't come back." Margaret never forgot that moment. From that day on, she made a silent vow. Never again would someone define her worth by her color or her silence. She studied hard. Books became her weapon, knowledge her armor. A full-ride scholarship carried her to a prestigious business school in New York. But no degree could shield her from the doubts in every interview room. They told her black women weren't a good fit for leadership roles, that companies needed a different image. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She worked twice as hard. She stayed late. She took notes in silence. Where others saw rejection, she saw strategy. What she lacked in access, she made up for in resolve. At 38, she founded Ellis Ventures, a small investment firm built from a decade of quiet savings. 10 years later, she had backed over 15 startups, 3 of which became unicorns. She never chased headlines. She never sought credit. She invested in people and in purpose, in vision. And then she turned her eye to aviation, an industry so vast and established that few thought it could be touched. But then came the pandemic. Airlines faltered, stocks plummeted, investors fled. United Skies, once a beacon of reliability, was in crisis. Where others saw collapse, Margaret saw opportunity. Quietly, she began acquiring shares, not through corporate arms or shell companies. She used her own name. Every transaction was personal, intentional, discreet, and within 6 months, she held over 41 cents, enough to become the single largest shareholder, enough to change the course of the company. But she didn't announce it. Not yet. First, she wanted to see the truth for herself, unfiltered, unpolished. That's why she booked this flight under her real name. No fanfare, no executive access, just a first-class ticket, like anyone else. The moment she stepped out of the taxi that morning, she had a feeling. Not just a hunch, an instinct shaped by years of being on the outside. And every word, every glance, every barrier that Lana put in front of her only confirmed what she already knew. Judgment still ruled the front lines of customer service. But this time, she wasn't the girl watching her mother cry. She wasn't the assistant begging to be taken seriously. This time, she had power. Not for revenge, but for responsibility. She didn't want to expose just one person's mistake. She wanted to test the entire structure, because only by walking through its cracks could she understand where it needed to be rebuilt. The cabin slowly filled. A few passengers were adjusting their bags, others quietly taking their seats. Lana entered, her expression tight, steps more rigid than before. The young flight coordinator followed, visibly more respectful than earlier. He approached Margaret and leaned in slightly. "Ma'am, I just received confirmation from the executive office. Are you?" Margaret gave a simple nod. She didn't need to say yes. She turned her gaze out the window. The light outside was soft, almost serene, but within her, something far greater was shifting. A storm had passed, and she still had one more thing to do before the sky cleared completely. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was unusually still. The passengers had barely settled in, and yet silence filled the space like an invisible fog, heavy and tense. Margaret sat calmly in seat 2A. She adjusted her collar, slid her leather bag beneath the seat, and lifted her eyes to stare straight ahead, not with pride or resentment, but with quiet authority. A male flight attendant approached, ready to assist her with her luggage, but stopped when Lana entered the cabin. Her posture was stiff, her steps sharp, as if she were trying to reassert control. Her eyes swept across the cabin before settling once again on Margaret. There was hesitation in her gaze now, part disbelief, part defiance. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to vacate that seat," Lana said, her voice low but sharp. "I need to resolve this before takeoff." Margaret didn't move. Instead, she calmly reached into her bag and pulled out the thick, tan envelope with the red seal of United Sky's executive office. She opened it, revealing a neatly organized set of documents. From the stack, she took out a single business card and held it out. Lana accepted it, glanced at the bold letters printed across the front. Margaret Ellis, majority shareholder, United Skies Airlines. Her breath caught. Before she could react, Margaret's voice filled the space. Not loud, but clear and undeniable. "I am Margaret Ellis, the largest shareholder of this airline, with 41% of its stock and decisive voting power on the executive board." The entire cabin froze. The woman across from her blinked in disbelief. A businessman, halfway through storing his luggage overhead, paused with his hand still gripping the handle. Margaret looked directly at Lana. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but steady, measured, powerful. "I didn't come here to make a scene. I didn't come here to test protocol. I came to see what happens when a customer, especially one who looks like me, is treated without assumption, without judgment." A hush settled over the cabin. Lana struggled to respond. Her mouth opened, then closed again as she tried to gather words that refused to come. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. No, Margaret interrupted gently. You didn't know, but you assumed. That's the problem. You didn't see someone who looked like your usual first-class passengers. I wasn't dressed the part. I'm a woman. I'm black. And based on that alone, you decided I didn't belong here. Every word after that, every denial, every glance, every call on your radio was built on that assumption. Lana lowered her eyes. Her hands trembled. Another flight attendant nearby tried to maintain composure, but the tension in their posture betrayed them. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands. The truth of it all was unfolding too fast for anyone to pretend otherwise. Margaret held the envelope with one hand, her voice now carrying not just to Lana, but to everyone present. I've already forwarded a full report of this incident to Human Resources and the Executive Office. I didn't do it out of anger, but I won't allow anyone to damage this company's reputation with behavior rooted in personal bias. I'm requesting that you be removed from this flight, and within 30 minutes, Human Resources will be calling you to confirm your dismissal. A smattering of applause rose from the back of the cabin, first hesitant, then stronger. One by one, passengers joined in, not because they were impressed, but because something that had long been unspoken was finally said out loud. The man live streaming whispered into his phone, "I can't believe I just witnessed that." A black woman a few rows back pulled her daughter close, eyes glistening. "You see that, baby? We deserve to be respected, no matter what." Lana could barely walk. A fellow crew member escorted her out of the cabin as she fought to keep her composure. For the first time in her career, she understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of judgment. Margaret returned to her seat, retrieved a different file from her bag, and flipped it open as if nothing had happened. A male attendant approached with a glass of water. "Miss Ellis, is there anything else I can get you?" She smiled gently. "No, thank you. You've been professional throughout. I appreciate that." Behind her, a young girl no older than 10 sat by the window, staring at Margaret with wide eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "I want to be like her when I grow up." The plane began to taxi. A soft announcement from the flight deck explained a brief delay due to an internal personnel issue. No one complained, because everyone on board knew this flight wasn't just about reaching a destination. They had just witnessed justice take flight, right here, at 30,000 feet. The aircraft door closed behind Lana, sealing off not just the cabin, but a moment that no one aboard would soon forget. Margaret remained in seat 2A, her gaze steady through the window, her posture relaxed, yet something in the cabin had shifted. What had just happened wasn't merely personal, it felt collective. Just minutes after the plane began to taxi, an internal email from United Sky's executive office was delivered to the entire flight crew. The message was short, precise, and left no room for ambiguity. Flight attendant Lana Whitmore was officially suspended pending investigation, with probable immediate termination for gross misconduct and violation of anti-discrimination policy. What startled many even more than the decision was the signature at the bottom. Margaret Ellis. As the plane rolled toward the runway, the captain emerged from the cockpit. Holding the intercom mic, he stood tall at the front of the cabin, formal, composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before takeoff, I'd like to extend our deepest apologies on behalf of United Skies for the incident you just witnessed. Let me assure you, every single passenger, regardless of gender, background, or appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." He paused, sweeping the room with his eyes. "Today, we're honored to have on board someone who is not just a first-class passenger, but a woman who is helping reshape the future of this airline. Miss Margaret Ellis, our largest shareholder." Applause broke out, not in surprise, but in recognition. People weren't just clapping for her title. They were clapping for what she had done with it. A white woman in row 3 turned to Margaret with quiet sincerity. "Thank you for not staying silent, for making me rethink how I see people." A black man a few rows back offered a respectful nod. "If you're changing this airline, you've got my support." A young flight attendant near the galley whispered to her colleague, 6 years in this job, and I've never seen someone speak truth to power like that." Margaret smiled gently. It wasn't a triumphant smile, but a meaningful one. The smile of someone who had planted a seed, not to claim victory, but to inspire something better. At the back of the plane, the young man who had live streamed the encounter lowered his phone, eyes wide with disbelief. The clip he posted, showing Lana's removal and Margaret's declaration, was now gaining tens of thousands of views by the minute. Hashtags like #RespectMargaret and #ChangeTakesFlight were trending globally. People weren't just watching. They were sharing, commenting, demanding other airlines reevaluate their own policies. The plane lifted off the ground, ascending into the clouds. But it wasn't just carrying passengers anymore. It carried something new, an energy, a belief, a story. Because when the aircraft touched down in New York, a press conference had already been arranged. Not a flashy event with corporate banners or camera crews, but a simple room with just enough chairs, a few reporters, and a short statement that would ripple through the entire industry. Margaret was set to announce a new initiative: zero tolerance for discrimination. A complete overhaul of training for all United Skies personnel, from top executives to entry-level staff. A new independent response division would be launched, empowering passengers and employees to report misconduct without fear of dismissal or silence. It was no longer just Margaret's story. It was now a blueprint, a vision for what equity in service could actually look like. And she knew, with every policy she signed under the name Margaret Ellis, it would never be just a symbolic gesture. It would be action. 3 days after the fateful flight, as headlines began to settle and the viral video of Lana's dismissal passed the 1 million view mark, Margaret received an email, short, polite, but heavier than anything else she had read all week. The sender, Lana Whitmore. Subject line, "I'd like to meet." Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment. Several close associates had advised her to ignore it. "It's over," they said. "Why give her more attention? Forgiveness weakens the message." But Margaret knew better. Real change doesn't come from public statements. It begins in quiet conversations, in the hard work of facing our worst selves. She agreed to the meeting. They met at a small coffee shop near United Skies headquarters. No boardrooms, no assistants, no cameras. Just two women, once locked on opposite sides of a power dynamic, now sitting face to face in the soft afternoon light that streamed through the windows. Lana arrived early. She looked different, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, dark circles beneath her eyes. When Margaret entered, Lana stood immediately, bowed her head slightly, and said in a low voice, "Thank you for coming." Margaret nodded, not coldly, but not warmly either. "I think it's time for a real conversation, one between two people, not a shareholder and a former employee." They sat. The silence between them stretched, delicate but not tense. Then Lana spoke first, her voice hoarse, like she had rehearsed these words all night. "I know I was wrong. I'm not here to make excuses. I need you to know I'm not heartless." Margaret listened without interrupting. Lena stared at the table, gripping her cup of cold coffee like it was the only thing anchoring her. "My mother always told me," Lena continued, "never take chances when dealing with passengers. If they don't look trustworthy, be cautious. If they don't look respectable, be firm." I carried that mindset into my work, into every interaction, every judgment, and I didn't realize I had become the very thing my mother feared most, someone who judged without knowing, who mistreated someone like you. Her voice cracked. She stopped to catch her breath, but didn't wipe away the tear that slid down her cheek. "I've been treated unfairly as a woman," she added, "but I never realized I was doing the same to someone else, to you. And probably more than once." Margaret didn't respond right away. She studied Lana, not with the gaze of someone who had won, but as someone searching for something real beneath the layers of shame. "I'm not angry because you discriminated against me," Margaret finally said. "I'm angry because you didn't even realize you were doing it. You didn't know who I was, which is fine. That's not what matters. What matters is that from the moment you saw me, you decided I didn't belong. Not because I misbehaved, not because I said anything, but because I didn't look the part." She paused. Her tone remained calm, but her eyes were unflinching. "The most dangerous kind of discrimination is the kind people don't realize they're practicing." Lana lowered her head again, this time not to hide, but to take it in. "I can't decide your future," Margaret continued, her voice gentler now. "But I will say this, if you truly want to change, don't start with an apology. Start by educating yourself. not to impress anyone, but so you don't hurt someone else the way you hurt me." Lana nodded. No defense, no deflection, just the silent acceptance of someone finally facing herself. Margaret stood and picked up her bag. Before leaving, she looked back, offering a final word, not a door slammed shut, but one slightly ajar. "I'm not offering forgiveness today. Forgiveness is a journey, not a meeting. But I believe anyone can relearn if they're humble enough to listen." Lana remained seated, watching Margaret disappear through the glass door. For the first time in days, she didn't cry. She simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath, like someone who had finally stepped out of a long, dark hallway. 2 weeks after Flight US 714, the headquarters of United Skies in New York hosted a day unlike any other in its history. The main conference hall, usually reserved for executive meetings and data-heavy presentations, had been rearranged. Rows of simple chairs, a modest platform, no stage lights or branding banners. There were no booming speakers or corporate fanfare, just a quiet sign hanging behind the podium. An airline for everyone. The guests that morning weren't just executives and investors. They included a handful of passengers from that now famous flight. Longtime airline staff who had never been invited to a press event before, and a few quietly curious journalists. The atmosphere was calm, not tense, but expectant. People came not for a spectacle, but for something real. When the name Margaret Ellis was announced, the room stood up, spontaneously, without prompting. But she walked to the podium the same way she always had, measured, steady, without pretense. No designer dress, no entourage. Just a woman in a simple dark suit, carrying a folded speech in one hand and a quiet fire in her eyes. She paused at the microphone and looked out at the room. Then came the smile, small, knowing. "Today," she began, "I'm not standing here as United Skies' largest shareholder. I'm standing here as someone who has been misjudged and knows there are millions of others who've been misjudged the same way." Her voice wasn't raised, but her words carried far. "I don't want an airline that's only good at serving people who look wealthy. I want one where every passenger, no matter where they come from, how they dress, or what accent they speak with, is welcomed with the same dignity." She opened the speech in her hand, but didn't read from it. She looked straight ahead, speaking from somewhere deeper. "As of today, United Skies is adopting a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination. All staff, from executives to new hires, will undergo intensive retraining on equity, inclusion, and cultural awareness. We're also launching an independent response unit where passengers and employees alike can safely report misconduct without fear of being ignored, silenced, or retaliated against. And once a year, we'll hold a day of equity, not to hand out awards, but to remind ourselves, respect is not a luxury, it's the bare minimum." The room held its breath. A young journalist stood and asked gently, "Miss Ellis, what do you think will be the biggest challenge in making this happen?" Margaret thought for a moment, then replied, "The biggest challenge isn't the system, it's the people, the ways we're taught to see each other. Those go deep, but I believe if we're willing to really listen, everything can change." Applause filled the room, not thunderous but steady, a sound of shared resolve. Within hours, news outlets everywhere had picked up the story. Margaret's photo appeared across social media under headlines like, "The woman who made the skies fairer," from Target to Trailblazer. Not just a shareholder, a reformer. Hashtags like #Fly with Respect and Ellis Effect trended worldwide. Other airlines began facing scrutiny, comparisons, and growing calls to audit their own practices. A ripple had begun, not just of awareness, but of accountability. A month later, back at Atlanta International, where it had all started, Margaret returned. Same simple outfit, same worn flats, but this time every staff member recognized her. They greeted her with respect, not because of her title, but because of what she had done. A young black flight attendant approached her at the gate, eyes bright with pride. "Miss Ellis, today's my first flight, and I'm proud to work under the policy you created." Margaret smiled and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then remember this," she said. "Every passenger you serve, young or old, rich or poor, could be someone writing the next chapter of this world. Do what's right." The young woman nodded. As the plane took off once more, carrying Margaret toward her next destination, it felt different. Not just another flight, but a vessel carrying a message, a belief. that sometimes it takes just one person standing tall to change the skies for everyone.